Everyone, welcome to this video, the second lesson in the human body scheme. This one is about respiration. In the previous lesson, we introduced students to Harvey's idea that blood circulates around the body, and really it was a first glimpse of what we would know as, or describe, or call the double circulatory system. So we gave them this schematic picture of the blood going from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, and then to the body, and back to the heart again. This idea that it comes through the heart twice on each round that it does. Now what we're going to do in this lesson is build on what we did here. So firstly, we're going to take this idea that we saw in both Galen and Harvey, that the two really important things that we need to take in are something from the air when we breathe and something from our food when we eat. We're going to take that idea and use it to elaborate upon what we did over here and give an even more kind of detailed version of that double circulatory system. And the way we're going to introduce this again is through a bit of a historical case study, and it's just a really nice simple way of illustrating some really important things about respiration. Now in terms of historical accuracy, I'm going to be a little bit loose with historical accuracy. Hopefully you'll see though it illustrates the concept. So I'm going to describe an experiment in which a mouse is kept inside a box. So I'm going to draw my little mouse here. My mice are very simple. So there's a little mouse, and it's kept inside this box, and we might say it's a glass box, something like that, so we can see what's going on inside. And what we find is if we leave this mouse in the box with nothing else, then after, let's say, 2 days, what happens is, and it's a little bit sad, but what happens is this poor mouse is now a dead mouse, an ex-mouse. So if we were to draw it like that, I'll draw the ears there, put it on its back to show that it's now dead. So it lasts for 2 days. So already from this really simple experiment, and we're gonna credit this experiment to Lavoisier. It was actually lots of different people did experiments like this, from Mayo in the 17th century, Priestley in the 18th century. We're just going to say it was Lavoisier to keep things simple. And what the conclusion that Lavoisier drew from this experiment is, well, okay, if you leave a mouse in a sealed box for 2 days and then it dies, what that's saying is there's something in the air that we're using that's essential for life. And if after 2 days the mouse dies, well, that means we've kind of used it all up. So what this is saying is there's something essential to life in the air that we breathe. So let's imagine a slightly different experiment. It's almost the same. There's just one thing that's slightly different about it. So we've got our sealed glass box, we've got our mouse, like this. But this time, we put a candle inside. And we light it. So it's a lit candle inside the box. And again, this is a really nice opportunity to get students thinking. You could say to them, okay, show me your thumbs. Do you think the time it takes for the mouse to die is going to be longer, shorter, or the same? Get a whole class response, maybe ask a few students why they think that. Hopefully elicit the idea that actually it's going to be sooner. And when Mayo did this experiment in the 1600s, he found the time was about half. So the mouse lasted half as long in this box. So what we have here, and again, I think it's worth drawing the second picture. It may just seem a bit silly, but we can really illustrate what's going on here. Firstly, we have a dead mouse. Secondly, we can show that the candle goes out. You might want to add a bit of smoke like that, which is what happens when the candle goes out. So we can draw another conclusion here. Here, we realised in this experiment, well, there's something in the air that the mouse is using to stay alive. And when that something runs out, the mouse can live no longer. What we can draw from here, well, there's a couple of things really. One is that the same thing that the mouse is using to stay alive, that's taken from the air, is also being used by the candle for combustion. And what Lavoisier realised is, and this is why we use Lavoisier, he was the person who came up with the name oxygen, and he realised that there's something in the air that both of these things need is oxygen, whether it's burning a candle, whether it's a mouse trying to stay alive. What we can also notice here is that there must be some sort of chemical reaction going on here that's analogous, that's kind of similar, because we know that when a candle burns, we are reacting wax from the candle with the oxygen in the air. This is what Lavoisier realised, and that is releasing energy in the form of heat or light, radiation, whatever, and it also makes some products. Now, we don't need to go too much into the products yet, but we'll come back to that in a minute. What Lavoisier realised is what's going on inside the mouse is exactly the same, but instead of wax being the fuel, like it is with the candle, the fuel that the mouse would be using is its food, and we can think about the food we eat as well. And what we're doing here is bringing it back to that idea that there's two things that we have to take in. One is something from the air when we breathe. Lavoisier told us it's oxygen. The other thing is something from the food that we eat. And I'm not sure whether Lavoisier called it glucose, but we're going to tell the students that it's glucose anyway. So what we can do is present the findings of these experiments by comparing what's going on with the candle to what's going on with the mouse. So we know that both of these things require oxygen. Let's put candle and mouse. Both of these things require oxygen. So I'll write oxygen here as one of our reactants in both cases. But what we want to do is compare fuel for the candle, which I'm going to keep it simple, I'm just going to call the wax, with the fuel for the mouse, which I'm going to tell students is actually glucose, and that comes from our food. And you might want to put food in here, just so they're really clear, because we're going to explore this in much more detail when we look at the digestive system. Now, we can just tell them as well, at this stage, what Lavoisier realised is, I mean, he called it fixed air and water vapour, but we're going to call it carbon dioxide. The products in both cases are the same. So we get carbon dioxide, which they've come across in the previous unit on an introduction to chemistry. And in both cases, we also get some water vapour. And you can do the whole thing where if you breathe out your hand, you can feel the water vapour on your hand. But we're just going to put it like this for now. So plus water, plus water. So what we can do then is, really the purpose here is to draw students' attention to the similarity between this combustion reaction in the candle and respiration inside the mouse. So we can label those, we can call it combustion, so students know this is what combustion is. We can put in brackets burning, because it's the same thing. And then in this case, we're going to have to tell them what Lavoisier said, and this was, others had said this before, but we're just going to say, he realised that there's this similar chemical reaction going on inside our bodies, which we call respiration. Respiration. And notice we're not talking about mitochondria or anything like that yet. We're keeping it quite macro, because that's where our Year 7 students are at. They're seeing things in quite concrete terms. Now, the last thing to say about both of these is that what Lavoisier realised is they both release energy. So we can think about how the candle heats the surroundings and so on. Lavoisier actually called it animal heat, but what he meant by that was the heating of the surroundings that we do because we're respiring. So we could both, in both cases, maybe let's put it over here, we can put energy. And that's something to stress to your students, that respiration is a chemical reaction that happens inside our bodies and it releases energy, just like combustion. Now what we can do once we've gone through this, and there's some questions in the slides, depending on how you want to structure your lessons, you might want to do some questions on this part of the lesson first and then move on to the double circulatory system next. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to go through the double circulatory system now. What this does is gives us a bit more of an elaborate version. I might just leave that one up there so you can see. A bit more of an elaborate version of our circulatory system. And again, it's these two concepts, circulation and respiration, that explain everything that's going on in the nearly everything, in the digestive system, circulatory system, the respiratory system, and so on. So everything that we're going to look at is going to be tied together by this thread that runs all the way through. So what we can do here is now say, well, okay, we've realized that what we need, two things from outside. One, glucose from the food we eat. Two, oxygen from the air we breathe. So now we've got to think, well, how is it that that's moved around our bodies? So we can start with the heart again. If you want, you could draw a kind of gingerbread person to make it more concrete. I'm just going to go straight to the schematic this time because I would have recapped what we did last lesson anyway. So I'm going to say, now we've got this more, slightly more complex picture that we can give to students. So what happens? Well, blood travels through the heart and it leaves out of the heart and goes to the lungs. So this is what we looked at last time. Hopefully this shouldn't be news to your students. You might want to add here that it goes through the arteries from the heart to the lungs. Again, we don't need to worry about pulmonary right now because we're just giving them this overall picture at this stage. We can do the more detailed naming later. And then it goes back to the heart. But what we can add now with this picture is, well, what's happened in the lungs? Well, it's got one of our things that we need, that we saw from the whole mouse experiment thing, which is oxygen. So we can say oxygen taken in. But also, we can just tell students now, because this is happening inside our body, we need some way of getting rid of this carbon dioxide and water. We don't really need those, they're just a byproduct. So we can add carbon dioxide plus water out. So that's all happening in the lungs. So then we can kind of build upon what we did last time. And I'm going to draw a bit of a longer line here for reasons that will become obvious in a minute. So we then said, okay, blood goes from the heart to the lungs. This is what Harvey told us. Then comes back to the heart and then goes out to the body. And again, it goes out through an artery and it comes back from the body to the heart through a vein. But what we can do now is add this kind of extra stage to say, but hang on, okay, what's happening in the body? Well, in fact, let's do this part first. So we're going to say, okay, oxygen plus glucose used, and then we can say carbon dioxide. If you want, you can just put CO2. I'm going to write it out though. Carbon dioxide plus water produced. This is what happens inside our body in all the different places. Again, we can come to the cell picture later, but right now we're dealing at quite a macro level. And we might also want to add something about energy being released. Energy released. So we can give them this picture. And what you want to do is say, okay, so we get the oxygen from the lungs and we get rid of the carbon dioxide and water through the lungs as well. The heart is what's pumping it all around. It keeps it going in this circle. But hang on, what about the glucose? Where does that come from? So now we can make our double circulatory system a bit more elaborate because we can add this extra stage here, is that some of that blood that goes out from the heart to the body goes to the digestive system. And again, you might, I'm in the slides, I've just called it the intestines. So I'll do this capital. Intestine plus the liver. It goes through that way and then it comes back through a vein to the heart. And there might be some questions about, okay, does it do 3 laps? You can kind of say when it comes here, it just keeps a good level of blood glucose, a good amount of glucose in the blood at all times. Yeah, you can kind of gloss that a little bit at this stage. We're just trying to give them this macro picture with which they can make sense of all the fine details that we'll zoom in on later in the scheme. And the final thing to add then is, well, what's going on here? This is where you get the glucose in. So hopefully by sketching it out like this, with reference to these mice experiment that show, well, we need oxygen and kind of show the similarities between respiration and combustion to show that we need this fuel as well. Ours is obviously glucose. Then we can build this more elaborate system And this picture is what we're going to keep coming back to again and again and again and again. Throughout this scheme, every time we look at adaptations of the alveoli, or what's going on in the small intestine with the villi, or why valves have veins but arteries don't, and so on, we're always going to refer back to this picture so that students have a clear sense of how everything fits together. And that's what's going to give them a really thorough knowledge, and it's also going to help them remember it better because they've got this really clear conceptual framework. In the next lesson, we'll begin to zoom in a little bit more, and we'll think about what happens in our bodies during exercise.